In our survey of life, we're starting by surveying the 3 domains. And so just to remind you, we've got our phylogenetic tree, domain bacteria, domain archaea, and domain eukarya. And so domain bacteria and domain archaea are loosely categorized as the prokaryotes, even though they are not super close relatives. And we are going to focus now on domain eukarya. Domain eukarya is the one that contains most of the organisms that we're familiar with, including ourselves and other animals. But it also includes some unicellular organisms that we're less familiar with, and that will be the focus of this chapter. So to start out, let's remember that domain eukarya includes organisms that have membrane-bound organelles. The nucleus is an example of that. So it divides up the cell into compartments with specialized functions for each of those compartments. So like the endoplasmic reticulum, the mitochondria, the chloroplasts, the peroxisomes, all of those are these compartmentalized units. As we talked about before, mitochondria and chloroplasts were acquired through endosymbiosis when an early eukaryotic cell engulfed a prokaryotic cell. So in addition to kind of these classic differences, another feature of eukaryotic cells is a well-developed cytoskeleton. So these include things like microtubules, actin filaments, and intermediate filaments that crisscross the eukaryotic cell. Domain eukarya can include single-celled or unicellular organisms, colonial organisms, and organisms that display true multicellularity. So single-celled means the organism is entirely just one cell. So again, another word for that is unicellular. If they're living colonially, that means they can live apart. Or they can live together. So a colony, like they're choosing to live together, they might even be getting benefits from living together, but they don't have to live together. They can live on their own. Whereas true multicellularity is an organism like us. The cells depend on each other. So for example, all of your cells need oxygen, and they rely on lung cells to help bring that oxygen into them. You rely on your digestive cells to get sugar to all your other cells. So we're truly multicellular. Our cells are truly dependent on other cells. And so within domain eukarya, you see all 3 of these lifestyles. The first eukaryotes probably date to about 1.8 billion years ago, so that's the oldest fossils that we have. Once the first eukaryotic cells arose, really the multicellularity came about really fast by, considering the evolutionary history, right? 0.6 billion years to get to multicellular life is pretty quick. We also see complex sexual life cycles arise around the same time. Probably not a coincidence, they're probably related to each other. And then larger eukaryotes occurred just about 600 million years ago. So for a long time, there was really small multicellular organisms. So in this chapter, we focus on the protists. The protists is a really, really loose group of eukaryotes. And so the term just kind of means they're not animals, they're not plants, and they're not fungi. Some of them are relatives of plants, animals, and fungi, but they're not actually plants, animals, and fungi. And so they were sort of identified for 2 common characteristics. They tend to live in water or moist habitats, so things like ponds, for example, or the ocean. And most of them are microscopic, so you can't see them with the naked eye. When we say loose group, this is not a taxonomic group. So what I mean about that, or by that, is that it's not related to evolutionary ancestry. So while protists might look alike or share some characteristics, it doesn't mean that they're close relatives of each other. And in fact, the protists are now divided into supergroups based on ancestry. So when we look at taxonomic ranks, domain eukarya is broken into several supergroups. And protist is not a supergroup. So instead, we're going to see that this loose categorization is broken into several supergroups, but protist is not a supergroup. So again, that's why we say loose group. It's not aligning with these taxonomic ranks. It's not aligned to evolutionary history. Now, so why are we still using this term if it doesn't tell us about evolutionary history? Remember, the goal of taxonomy is to generally make all of our terms relate to evolutionary history. And the reason is just that this term is super historic. People really like to use it still. And it is such a big group, and they do tend to live in similar environments. People just really like to still use a lot of these non-taxonomic terms. So that's why we learn this term, even though it's not a supergroup, it's not a taxonomic rank. And it's also why we're going to introduce several other terms that are not taxonomic ranks. Again, these terms are still very widespread, in use, very widespread, and so it's important for anyone who wants to learn about biology to be familiar with these terms. So we'll go into some of these other terms that are not about ancestry. So the first set of terms here is when protists are classified based on their ecological role. So that means like their role in the food system. So for example, we have the term algae. So some protists are algae. That means they're photoautotrophic. So remember, that means they do photosynthesis. So what color are algae generally going to be? Green. Okay, so there's some exceptions and we'll talk about that, but algae are oftentimes green. Another term here is protozoans, or the protozoa. Protozoa are heterotrophic. That means they have to eat other things. So some protists are eating the algae, for example. And then a third term here is fungus-like. And so this term is referencing the fact that they sort of look like fungi, and really they look kind of like mold, so fungi that are mold. And then they feed in a similar way to fungi. But remember, this doesn't mean that they're close relatives of fungi. This term is just referencing that they kind of reminded people of fungi, but it's not about their ancestry. And in fact, the fungus-like protists are not related to fungi. So reiterating here that these terms are not about taxonomic ranks. They don't tell us about the evolutionary history of these organisms, but again, they're in widespread use. So similarly, we have terms that relate to when they're described based on their habitat. So remember, I said that they're often in moist environments, so lakes, oceans, wetlands, swamps, rivers. And so when protists are found in these bodies of water, they're referred to as plankton. And you've probably heard that term before. Many of us have. And so plankton are swimming or floating protists. Phytoplankton means plant-like. So plant-like plankton, this root phyto means plant, are photosynthetic. So again, what color are those typically? Green. Then we have this term protozoa again. Protozoan plankton, also sometimes written just abbreviated protoplankton, or zooplankton, are heterotrophic. So they are feeding on the phytoplankton. So again, if you think about this in the context of a food web, in the ocean you have phytoplankton that are base of the food chain, and then the zooplankton that are eating them. So these are generally unicellular. Some of them are colonies, or they might even take on a colony form that's a filament. So these are examples of some plankton. This is a single-celled plankton. This is a colonial plankton. So we see one cell and they organize into this really pretty under the microscope little crystalline structure. And this is a filamentous plankton. So again, we have individual cells here lining up with each other in a long string. which is what filament means. And then another term for ones that live in the ocean or in water are Paraphyton. These ones are even more plant-like. So they are multicellular, and that's what makes them even more plant-like. They go by names like seaweed or macroalgae, macro referencing big. So these are examples of some of these. Here's a seaweed, and you can see this with the naked eye. This one as well, this is under a microscope, but this looks like green strings with the naked eye, so you can actually see it without a microscope because they're much larger. But again, they're not plants. So I'm just going to reiterate this. They are not plants. They're not in kingdom Plantae, even though at first glance you might think they would be. And then another way that protists have been named related to different things about their bodies rather than their phylogeny is based on their motility. So if they have flagella, they are named flagellates. If they have cilia, they're named ciliates. So this is a ciliate here. So see all the cilia along its cell membrane. And then if it has amoeboid movement, is called an amoeba. So this is an amoeba right here. And amoeboid movement involves these structures called pseudopods. So I'm going to draw a more simplified cell here to illustrate how amoeboid movement works. So they might have the cell like this, and then it's going to send out or make a pseudopod. So it squeezes its plasma membrane. So imagine if that was a balloon and I was squeezing right there. That's going to push out that area of the cell. So this part is pushed out into this, and this is what's called a pseudopod. So again, what's pictured here. And then what happens is all of this fluid starts to move where the pseudopod is. So we pushed fluid this way. Now the rest of the fluid is going to get pushed this way. And then the cell goes back to its original shape. But because it pushed this way, the cell has moved a tiny bit this direction. So it squeezes the cytosol into a pseudopod, and then that liquid movement of the cytosol moves to where the pseudopod went, and so that moves the cell a little bit. And so that's amoeboid movement. And again, organisms that move that way are referred to as amoebas.